good luck. So, without wasting time, let's welcome the Prime Minister. But I will kindly request from the Prime Minister, if you come, kindly indicate your POI preference, your preferred pronouns, and then you can start your speech. Okay, thank you very much. So, without wasting time, let's welcome the Prime Minister to start the debate. Here.
Hello everyone. Chair, please confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
All right. Yeah. So my gender pronouns he, him. Preferred POIs should be my POI should be in my 5th minute. Please don't badger my speech. If it's my 5th minute, just unmute your mic and ask. I will take you. With that being said, all right, I'll be starting the speech in three. Sorry, my timer. 3, 2, 1. Panel the House, understand that we exist in a world where resources are scarce. It means then that for any movement to actually carry out its goals and continue to create more traction for itself, it needs to maximize those resources, right? That is why we think that this environmental movement, as a movement that has a particular goal, should pursue incentives or should pursue things that not just align with their goal, but also gives them more traction considering the scarce nature of resources. In terms of framing, there are 4 things here. First, what does this endangerment look like? Understand that endangerment of a particular species is something that is going to happen regardless, right? Means then that no matter the amount of effort you put into preserving them and all whatnot, these endangerments are going to happen regardless due to things like a particular species going into extinction and all whatnot, right? But secondly, right, understand that this motion says it's a concentration. It means then that we are not letting go of the endangered species. What we are just doing is that we are putting more focus on this keystone species. What this invariably means is that opposition cannot say our word is a word that totally deprives or put this endangered species in a world where they no longer exist. It means then that we can actually achieve both, but more priority is being given to the keystone species. You understand the importance of this framing later in my speech. The second thing to frame out in this debate is on the nature of this environmental movement. Because at the end of the day, this is the major stakeholder in this debate, right? You have to understand that them carrying out this action of concentrating on preserving one species or the other falls within their basic jurisdiction and expertise. This is because they have more knowledge about these species and plants. They have more expertise to actually carry out this stuff. Notice then that the government officer may not necessarily have in-depth knowledge about the intricacies of these plants and all whatnot, but it's within the jurisdiction of these environmental movements to actually carry out this stuff. Another thing you have to understand in terms of the environmental movement is that these guys are often funded by the level of traction they create within society, right? In particular, environmental movement is doing stuff that utilizes their full expertise and jurisdiction, and that stuff is something that is creating significant pragmatic utility for the society. They are more likely to get more sponsorship from both private sector and both the government sector, right? It means that they have to make the most out of the circumstances. The third thing to frame out here, because we don't want a messy debate, is what does disproportionately in the motion entails. It simply means that these keystone species are not evenly distributed among different countries of the world, right? They are distributed across different countries to different levels. Despite the fact that it is disproportionate, we exist in a world whereby no country has enough. It means then that these keystone species are not enough in any country. And there are some countries that they are way lesser. The last thing to frame out here is that we concede to the fact that these endangered species are highly beneficial to the society. Because I know opposition is going to argue how they do things like contribute to tourism and recreation and how tourism is beneficial to society, blah blah blah. Here, beginning of my speech, we already concede to that. But we think your focus on these debates should be on the comparative, which will provide more traction for this environmental movement because they are the major stakeholders within the debate. Secondly, which species contributes more to the society? We think if we're able to prove to you why our society is comparatively better despite their benefits, we win them in terms of comparative benefits. There are 3 things here to argue. The first is on the principle, and that is the principle of utility. It simply says that for you to prioritize or concentrate on something, you must prioritize on something that provides you more utility to the society. I already explained to you my framing how resources are scarce. Who is speaking? Please mute your mic. I already explained to you how resources are scarce in of themselves. It means that for this environmental movement themselves, guys, please mute your mic now. So, pause my time, Chair. I don't know who is muted. Who is unmuted? Like you are distracting me. Chair, Chair, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
What did my time stop at? I'm very sorry for this stuff. Like the
Okay,
person was just distracting.
3:30, 3:30. So it remains 3:30.
3:30.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll be restarting in 3, 2, 1. So what I was trying to explain is the principle of utility. The principle simply says that you concentrate on things that provide you more utility. Now, for you to understand the importance of this principle, you have to remember my framing in the sense that resources of these environmental movements are inherently scarce. It means then that they have to do things that give them more traction, and from that traction, they can be able to like get more funding to actually like carry out their primary duties. Understand that these keystone species are ones that provide or ones that give back to the society. The info slide clearly tells you how they are very necessary for the society to actually thrive, right? These are things that basically are needed in society for us to have a stable ecosystem. It means that because they provide more utility rather than the counterpart of endangered species, which utility can just be like tied down to things like recreation and whatever opposition is going to run. Because this one provides a necessary benefit to the society, we think they should be more focused based on the principle of necessity. Second thing, right, you have to understand the impact of these keystone species. These are species that are needed for the sustenance of the ecosystem. It means that in a world where we do not prioritize on their conservation and like on their protection, they are most likely going to like be lost out or most likely going to go extinct. At that point in of itself, not just the animal world, but the human world in of itself becomes problematic. Why? Because the ecosystem in of itself becomes hampered due to the fact that these species that are needed for like sustenance of the ecosystem are no longer available. So we think on the principle of utility, because they provide more utility,
POI.
we think it is justified on principle for us to focus on their concentration. The next thing to argue here is on the justification of the fact that or the fact that it creates like an endangerment of other species. Before that, I'll take a POI.
So
Shoes, fast.
what makes you think the other person's the other species cannot also be taken care of? Why is that scarcity of resources only existing for those keystone species?
Okay, Chair, I think my framing already covers this, and I would really appreciate if debaters pay attention because that will really help us. I already explained to you how this concentration does not mean we are letting go of another species. It just simply means that because resources are scarce, we are going to focus on the one that gives us more benefits. We are not letting go of this one. We can still give them the benefits concentration they need, but we're not going to focus all our resources on them. Why? Because the principle of utility, we have one that provides more utility to the ecosystem. I expect opening and closing opposition to show how this endangered species provides more utility rather than this keystone species, considering that the motion already tells us that they are a necessity for the ecosystem because they contribute to the stability of the ecosystem. If they fail to do that, they cannot win us on the principle of utility. The next thing to argue here is on the justification, right? Because basically the motion tells you that it may lead to like the endangerment, like or it may lead to the detriment of the endangered species. Now, here it is. There are three premises here. First, Chair, understand that these endangered species actually have to exist in an ecosystem, right? For example, species like lions, species like other endangered species, which are usually being affected with things like poaching and all whatnot, actually are being affected, right? To the extent where like because of the ecosystem is no longer stable for them, they now become affected and all whatnot, right? It means then that the ecosystem in of itself is very important to them. So we think it is justified for us to actually do something that protects the ecosystem that is needed for them in and of themselves. Why? Because these keystone species are things that contributed to the existence and sustainability of the ecosystem. It invariably means that on principle, these guys invariably contribute to the existence of this endangered species, which depend on the ecosystem for their sustenance. So we think if your existence is dependent on something which is actually dependent on another, we think that order should actually be prioritized. The last thing to argue here is on the measures we could have within the debate, and this is where we think we need debate from the very start. Understand here that this debate is about the environmental movement. These are movements, okay, let me round up. These are movements that need traction for them to grow. We think that you should focus on something that contributes more to the ecosystem, that gives them more PRO, more support, and all whatnot that will enable them to carry their duties efficiently. No positions what they don't achieve that. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, that speaker, for that fine speech. Uh, a quick reminder: if a speaker is speaking, please kindly mute if you don't have any POI, not to badger the person's speech. Okay, without wasting time, let's welcome the leader of opposition to start the case of the opposition. Here.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Chair, my partner is unavailable, so I would have to iron this round. So if my partner doesn't join the call, so that's to state that at first.
Okay.
Okay, so let me
Okay.
just set my timer and start. All right, so I'll be starting for POIs. I'll take both OG and CG. Right. So let's have a conversational debate. So I really need sides to. All right, so I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So, panel, I think the first thing we have to understand is that in opening government's cases, they make a whole lot of concessions which they don't necessarily prove. Because, firstly, they start on the premise about the goal of this movement in and of themselves and how they are so important as a stakeholder to the context of today's debate. We don't think that's the contention within today's debate. We can all agree that it's about what this environmental movement should do at this particular point in time. But then more importantly, they don't show us how that goal in and of itself directly is tied to them saving these key species, as opposed to a world where they allow the endangered species to die. They basically tell us a whole lot of things about how these movements how these movements have a goal and all of those things, and how their goal is important.
I knew
They
that was going
don't
to
show
happen.
us
Like the guy campaigned for him. So,
how
like,
that directly keys into the please mute. How that directly keys into the context of today's debate. So in terms of rebuttal, right? So what we basically get, or what we needed to be to come from opening government within today's debate, are two things. Firstly, that they needed to prove that it is essential to protect these keystone species at the expense of the endangered species. That's the conversation to be had in today's debate. And then, more importantly, you basically have to justify a world in which you allow these key endangered species to die as a movement, because that's the nuance to be within the debate. That's the nexus at which today's debate occurs. The only thing we get briefly on this nexus at which the debate occurs from opening government was a one-liner on how, because of the fact that the endangered species exist within the ecosystem, and since the keystone species directly benefit the ecosystem somehow, then it's justified for them to die. That basically makes no sense, panel, on several levels. Because firstly, if you are saying that in terms of utility, it's because your resources are scarce, then why exactly are you prioritizing these keystone species at the expense of the other ones? But then more importantly, you say if you feel that the point is that the endangered species are non-renewable, like they can't replenish, right? That's why they are largely going to become extinct. And in a world where you say because for some reason the keystone species contributed to the ecosystem, therefore we are justified to allow these endangered species to die, it makes basically no sense. And more importantly, it goes against the principles of your movement as an environmental body. And I think that's what you get from our speech. Two things you get from LO in today's debate. Firstly, the importance of an egalitarian approach to environmental conservatism. And then secondly, the idea of other bodies and how we have other persons who are much directly, who can tackle several of these problems, as opposed to a world where we can focus on these endangered species in and of itself. The burden on our side is to tell you this, that first, the rationale behind the principle of environmental conservatism and environmental movements, which is something that we have to interrogate within the context of this, is to ensure a holistic approach towards environmental protection. Environmental movements are movements that are spurred from the fact that several species are neglected within status quo. Several species who most statutory bodies don't take cognizance of are dying and being endangered in status quo. That's why environmental movements in and of themselves exist, to ensure that those species that live at the edges of society, that don't get attention from more statutory bodies, get attention from these environmental movements. That's why they largely sprung up. That's the principle of an egalitarian approach towards conservatism. And that's something that directly speaks to the principle of that movement in and of itself. Panel, the impact within today's debate is that in a world on opening on government bench, where you say that you are very much justified to allow this other species to basically die off simply because for some reason, weirdly, because of the fact that some other persons contribute to the ecosystem, it means you are justified to do that. It makes no sense because it goes against the principle of that movement by and large. But then more importantly, we think the environmental movements are not justified to ask the question of who to protect. It is something that is supposed to be holistic across board. You don't even have the right to say, oh, let us now prioritize this particular species because for some reason we think that this species is more important than the other ones. It goes against the exact nature of the principles of that environmental movement, which is sort of an equal approach towards approaching environmental issues. I'll take the POI now.
Now, in a world where resources are not enough to take care of the boat, don't you think it is wise enough for an environmental movement to take care of what gives back to the environment rather than what doesn't give back to the environment?
All right, so panel, that is something that brings us to our second argument in today's debate, right? Because government bends tries to hinge their cases on some idea of resources, right? So if resources are scarce, we may agree that resources are scarce, right? But in panel, crucially, environmental movements are not the only movements who can do things in status quo. We still have governmental bodies and all of those things. Our second argument, panel, clearly is to say that in a world where we can lobby other bodies to prioritize those keystone species, it means we can now more importantly, as a body which wants to save species that other such bodies cannot save, we can now focus those scarce resources on saving those endangered species. The second level of analysis to this panel is to say that in status quo, we have government bodies who exist, and we have governmental ministries who have some level of functions towards the environment and all of those things. As environmental movements in and of itself, we think we can prioritize lobbying these other bodies, the UN, UNESCO, and all these relevant bodies to focus on keystone species, right? Basically, because they have more resources than us. But then more importantly, what speaks to the heart of our movement is that drive to ensure that those endangered species which exist on the fringes of society, away from the statutory protection that society affords them, who basically cannot access those levels of benefits in their habitats because they lack that focus. And we, as an environmental body, we can focus on all of those ones as opposed to trying to say, oh, these other species are more important because for some weirdly nonsensical reason. For some weirdly nonsensical reason, we think because the other ones contribute to the habitat, that case doesn't make sense. We tell you, panel, that firstly, it is particularly in the principle of the environmental movement to adopt an egalitarian approach towards environmental conservatism, and then more importantly, can focus our scarce resources on prioritizing those endangered species and adopting other means to ensure that we can get access and we can get further protection. Those ones who have from the other bodies who have more traction in society, in order to protect those other ones. We don't think it's in our nature to ask that question of who to protect as an environmental movement. We are very happy to.
Okay, thank you very much for that fine speech. Kindly be paying attention to the time posting in the chat space. Okay, let's welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to end the case from the opening government side. Here.
Yeah, panel, assuming I'm still very audible, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, you need to note that I've never paid attention to the case coming from opening government. So yeah, let us school them on. Sorry, can I restart? I didn't start my timer. Sorry about that. Panel, you're with me, ba?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, so I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Now, panel, you need to understand that opening opposition did not listen to most of the case of opening government. So now let's school them. They need to understand, based on our framing and characterization, we show you how endangerment is something that actually happens in and of itself without the impact of society. things like how dinosaurs are animals, dinosaurs are species that became endangered, things like how cavemen are species of human that became endangered. So endangerment is something that actually happens whether with the involvement of human or without the involvement of human. So in the best case scenario of their world, whereby we then decide to follow the principle of the importance of an egalitarian approach, whereby we decide to follow the importance of an egalitarian approach, it then means that what we are then doing in their world is to say, fine, okay, these people are endangered, so then let's take care of them. But you then need to note that there is now a trade-off in their own world, meaning that the trade-off in their own world is inherently means that the keystone species are no longer taken care of, which then means that at the end of the day, once this keystone species gets missing in the status quo then becomes bad because the keystone species are then given back to the status quo. Now, to rephrase what my partner has said, my partner engaged this debate on two levels of principles. Firstly is the principle of secondly is the principle of necessity. On the principle of utility, you hear from my partner where you say once you are saving an individual that is making much impact, then that save is more necessary and it's more needed for the society than an individual that is making less impact, which directly engages what you get from opening opposition, where they then tell you that it's not the choice of the environmental movement to do things like choose who they would who they will conserve or who they will not convert. But now you need to note that the legitimacy that the environmental movements have in choosing who they will conserve and who they will not conserve is based on the fact that these environmental movements are then things like experts in this type of situation, which then means government naturally don't give two fucks about keystone species or about animals in the country, which means that it is now based on the environmental movement to do what is best for the environment. And in today's debate, saving the keystone species is one thing that is best for the environment, and that is why we win over opening opposition in the opening up. Now, panel, I'll be giving engagement on this debate with two levels of principles and 4 levels of pragmatics. Firstly, on an extension to principle, panel, we believe in the principle of ecological integrity. Panel, we believe that we need to then do things like essentially keep the species that are doing things like bringing more integrity to the economy, which then means that when we are about to make a trade-off, this debate should be about the word that best suits the economy, the word that best suits the environment. And doing things like conserving this keystone species is one that best suits the environment on levels of impact and comparison with upward. The thing is, what you then get from upward is a world where you see things like this keystone species not being taken care of, which then means that this keystone species are inherently killed by themselves, which then means that this keystone species are missing in the status quo, which then means that the ecological and the environmental balance in the status quo becomes fucked up. And when this environmental balance in the status quo becomes fucked up, the status quo becomes unbearable for the individual living in it. But in our world, we have a status quo that is more preferable for even these endangered species themselves. Note, my partner explains that these endangered species also need an economy in which they can live in, which then means that even these endangered species need not to be protected, because once you don't protect this keystone species, the endangered species are not going to be living in a suitable environment also. Secondly, on principle, we believe on the principle of long-term sustainability. Panel, we believe that the sole purpose of every environmental movement is to do things like focus on the goals that are going to do things like have long-term sustainability in the status quo. Panel. Now, what is the comparative between the two words? The comparative between the two words is this: in our world, we ensure that this keystone continue giving back to the ecology, to the environment, which means that at the long run, these keystones continue working to favor the environment. But in the world of an endangered species, this fucking endangered species are no longer existing. It might remain only one and it might remain only two. We will later die due to natural causes at the end of the day, which means it's a wastage of resources and there's no long-term sustainability upon the fact that we've even shown you in our characterization that these individuals are not giving back to the status quo. Now, on 4 level of pragmatics, panel. Firstly, we believe firstly is on issue of cost effectiveness. Panel, we believe that conserving keystone species is more efficient than protecting individual endangered species. because these keystone species have been conserved in bulk. As my partner has told you, they're not evenly distributed in different nations, which means that the cost to conserve this endangered species is something that actually works fine and works and works better. Which means that it also buys into our world whereby we then tell you that there is not enough resources to go around, which means that which means that this keystone species are then doing things like giving back to the environment, giving back to the like showing profit and benefit to the money they're spending on them. Secondly, is on resource optimization. Panel, we believe that in a world whereby a keystone species has a leverage of doing things like has a leverage of doing things like having limited conservation resources, it then means that this keystone species should then be prioritized. No, the motion said at the expense of endangered species, meaning that in the big case of the world, these endangered species are not getting fucking killed, which means that what we are just trying to do is, if it's reached the extreme, let us stay with the keystone species. But when we then show you, as we've now shown you that this keystone species does not do things like absorb a lot of conservation resources, it then means that we also have the word to do things like conserve the endangered species. Number 4, we believe on adaptive management. We then believe that monitoring keystone does things like help conservation strategies for optimal outcomes. When you then see things that our scientists want to necessarily do things like ensure they find different ways of doing things like gaining more from this particular species in and of themselves. Fourthly, it's on community engagement. But we believe on the fourth pragmatics that if any optim want to run things like how endangered species bring things like tourism and all, we've already co-opted it in our world, as we then show you that this community engagement actually shows, as we then have things like volunteers and individuals who want to necessarily do things like engage in and keeping this particular keystone species alive. We believe that the house that wins in today's debate is the house that necessarily proves to you which word is more beneficial for the environmental guys, and also more beneficial for the ecology. And it's our house that win proudly, OG. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Let's welcome the deputy leader of opposition to end the case from the opening opposition. Here.
All right. Hope I'm still audible, Chair.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Cool. So my partner is not here, so I would have to iron. Okay, great. So yeah. All right. Just a second. Okay, so for the POIs, I'll take CG. So for the extension, I really need to take CG. Let's have the short diagonal. All right. So starting in 3, 2, 1. So panel, at the close of the opening half of today's debate, we need to identify the key clashes that have run within today's debate so far, and which side basically contributes more to those clashes to the extent of having an edge over the other. The first bit of conversation we've had, as opposed to several other arguments on framing and all of those things, is the principal idea of what to do with resources that are available. And that's where you can now get the contradiction that comes from PM and DPM. Because we now have an argument from DPM that now says that because we can now have more resources, because when in their world, like in DPM's world, when they prioritize this keystone species, for some reason, they have more resources to tackle the endangered species. But that's not the conversation that came from PM, because it was a concession to say that utilities are scarce, and therefore they would prioritize the keystone species because they give them more utility. That was the argument. We got that contradiction from DPM, so we it's difficult to harmonize their cases on both sides of OG. But then, more importantly, I think we also had a concession within the debate about this debate being about what these environmental movements should do and what they largely stand for. And our conversation and an argument on that front from OO was to tell you that we think principally these environmental movements are movements that know that the level of traction they can get in society in terms of saving these species are largely limited, because more importantly, they have resources that are limited, and then what they can do at every given point in time is limited. We think the implication of this now means that OG or CG would have to prove that in their world, they have so many of these resources to the extent of saying that, all right, because we can prioritize this other like species, then they give us some level of utility, as opposed to a world where you say, let's adopt a holistic approach towards tackling these problems. The response we got from opening government on our argument on why we think we can prioritize this endangered species, at least without or even at best not ask the question of who to protect, is that their response was to say that the government doesn't care about this like these habitats and all of those things, right? But panel, we prove to you that in our world, government is more likely to help out in taking care of those keystone species as opposed to those endangered species who the environmental movement should directly cater for. Why is this so? Panel, the first analysis here is that government need those keystone species more. Like, that's the class that exists in today's debate panel, right? Government needs those keystone species more. Why? Because firstly, those keystone species largely contribute to A, food, and then B, resources which the government needs to fulfill its duties to its citizens and its obligations to its citizens. These keystone species directly contribute to the furtherance of their own principal objectives as a government. That is why when the environmental movements can be able to focus on these endangered species, or at least holistically approach environmental conservatism without prioritizing one over the other, we think we can directly lobby the government to ensure that they do all of those things, because they need those keystone species more than the endangered species. And panel, that's the comparative that exists in today's debate, right? Because the government, or nobody else for that matter, gives a flying fuck about the fact that the black mamba is going extinct in some bush, right? Government doesn't care about them. Nobody cares about them. The only organization or the only body that can care about them are these environmental movements, who know the difference between having a snake that is slightly white or having a snake that is slightly yellow. Nobody gives a fuck that all the snakes in the bushes are dead, or these endangered species are going extinct. Nobody except those environmental movements do it. We think the impact in the conversation within today's debate is that it directly tallies to their principal objective as an environmental movement, because they exist to ensure that those species who basically cannot get that attention in society without having any movements, or without having a particular movement to directly take care of them, get that attention that they need. I'll take a POI from CG. Yes, go on.
CG, okay, yes. There's a concession in this debate that resources can be limited. In those instances, yes, when we choose to prioritize these keystone species, why is it not still justified?
I don't really get that POI, right? So when you prioritize, it means you don't get it, right? Because your resources, if you are considering that your resources are limited, it means you have to choose one above the other. Your burden in today's debate is to show why it is justified for you to do that, right? That's the debate. What you're asking me is the debate. You would have to prove that in your speech. Going further, let us understand what exactly we talk about when we speak about what these movements should largely stand for, right? Because understand how you don't say as an environmental movement that one species is more important than the other. We think that's something that you have to consider in the context of this debate, because it is based on a principle, and environmental movements largely are founded on a principle that says that society and nature is one. Therefore, you don't prioritize one above the other. And then more importantly, that man serves as a beacon to ensure a protection of the habitat and nature in and of itself in general. That's the principles upon which the environmental movements largely stand for. So what you do on either Bench's side, or either OG or CG side, is to say that we should go against this mandate as men, or mandate as being protectors of nature in society, to say that it is justified for us to have a world where we prioritize some level of benefit or impact as a society, because these keystone species give us some level of benefit, as opposed to having an approach that says that nature in and of itself is one. And that's the mandate of man, which is which this environmental movement largely stand to propagate. We think when you go against that, especially when we show you from OO that there are more viable alternatives for you to do all of these things, and why we are more likely to get traction and why the government can care more about those keystone habitats, then it's not justified for you to prioritize the keystone habitats or the keystone species at the expense of these endangered species. We tell you now that uniquely we stand as an environmental movement to ensure that we get the best out of society and out of nature and protect it based on that particular mandate. And then more importantly, we don't ask the question of who or which animal or which biological organism to protect. That goes against our objectives as an environmental movement. We are very happy to oppose.
Thank you very much for that first speech. Here we are at the end of the first half of the debate. Without wasting time, let's welcome the member of government to start the case of the closing side. Here.
Am I audible?
You are more than audible.
All right, thank you. So, my name is Hassan Usman. I'll be the member of government. My pronouns are he, him. POIs should be asked in my 50 minutes. I'm timing myself, so if you ask a POI when it's not my 50 minutes, I'm not going to take you. So, I think that's all. And just let me just confirm once again I'm audible before I start my speech.
Yes, you're audible.
All right, so starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I know if you like the opening half has not like really engaged the most important things into this debate. Both teams in the opening half were just like beating around the bush. Most of the arguments you get from opening governments were mostly assumptions, no impact to prove why their word, those utilities in their word are going to be achievable. We're going to like do all of this in the closing team, precisely closing government. And also like most of my arguments are like going to also like you get incorporated rebuttals to the open opposition. My partner is going to do more way ups and more clashes in a speech. Let's just go straight into my speech. First of all, on framing, panel, you need to understand that the value of a species is based on its role within the environment, which is why our side in today's debate we prioritize keystone species. We feel like this particular framing boils down to the comparative on conservation efforts versus the rights of animals. We don't think that any bench in the opening half was able to justify why we should prioritize the rights of animals who are under this keystone species rather than the animals like who are endangered species, which is something we get from our side. You need to understand, panel, that keystone species play a critical role in maintaining ecological balance. Keystone species are crucial to the survival of other species and stability of their environment. You need to understand, panel, that the idea here is that the primary goal in ecosystem health or balancing is not the inherent rights of individual species, but the protection of species with a greater good. What does this mean? Endangered species we are going to be deprioritized because they don't contribute as much to the overall ecosystem health. This is like an analogy is simple. Like humans, not all species are given the same level of protection. That is why a president has more security than an average citizen due to their unique contribution in ensuring the survival of the state. Which is why we think that today's debate cannot be about animal rights, but rather about how which species basically contributes to the greater good of the ecosystem. You need to understand, panel, that the prioritization of endangered species often involve tough choices based on limited resources. If like opening government tries to engage this, even like the open opposition like tries to answer to them, but they don't like do this very well. Listen to my speech and get why we are more better than the opening half. Panel, first of all, preserving or restoring habitats such as forests, wasteland, or even marine areas is often expensive. This can involve like things like having to purchase land, managing it to maintain its ecological balance, and even like preventing human encroachment. You need to understand that if you basically want to if this environmental movement basically want to concentrate on endangered species, what you do is that like it's going to be very hard for them to do. Understand that the nature of environmental movement are like these people are not like and they are not like rich organizations. Most of them basically thrive on public support or like government aid and etc. That is why we think that they should basically tilt towards a world in which they're like able to maximize resources. But then I think like secondly is on anti-poaching. Understand, panel, that protecting like individual endangered species from poaching like requires funding for rangers, even like monitoring system. Like they have to like buy things like drone or satellite tracking, and even like do things like take legal measures in areas with high poaching risk. What you have is that these measures are going to be critical and even expensive to maintain over time. But then thirdly, panel, is that you need to understand that reintroducing this endangered species like kitchen environments are very costly and even require specialized facilities, things like veterinary care, genetic management, and even like long-term monitoring to ensure that this animal survivor once we live back to society is going to be ascertained. Like these are things that we think that is not going to likely to exist. But then finally, you need to understand that conservation often requires extensive research to understand species needs, behaviors, and even traits. But because of most endangered species are going extinct, this is going to be hard. Ongoing monitoring and even like data collection, like it's not going to be like achievable, like due to like because of the basically required things like significant resources and the like. But then panel, you need to understand that raising public awareness of endangered species is going to involve like a lot of money, like things like educational program, like building system, like etc. This is why we think that this particular movement should not basically concentrate on the side of the position, rather it concentrate on our word. Panel understand that climate change is already a big issue in status quo, and this is already overburdening environmental movements. Understand that preventing endangered species from climate change, such as building wildlife corridors or altering water management, is going to require large-scale effort to reduce like carbon emissions or adapt to habitat. Understand that who is unmuted? I've watched my time. Who is that now? Guys, what is this for crying out loud now? You just disrupted my entire speech. I'm going to like resume my speech. I paused my time, so I'll read my speech in 3. I hope I'm still audible, panel.
Yes, you are still audible.
Am I still audible? All
Yes,
right.
you
So
are.
like you need to understand that these endangered species are basically affected by climate change. Until we're able to like reduce the impact of climate change on this ecosystem, we don't think that the environmental movement basically concentrate on them, which is why we think we're going to this debate. But then furthermore, on the comparative, understand that we think that our world is going to be like able to garner public and financial support. Why? Because many keystone species are charismatic and even have high public appeal, making it easier for like to attract donations, governmental support, and even sponsorships. This greater funding and awareness is going to basically impact the general health. But then also understand panel that keystone species are often well studied and even have established conservation programs in places such as anti-poaching units or even like habitat protection policies. This means that using these pre-existing frameworks reduces the cost of creating new strategies from scratch and allows for more efficient resource use. That they're already existing existing alternative to basically ensure that there is a sustainability of keystone species,
UI.
which does not happen for the same thing when it comes to conservative like this endangered species. But then why do we basically prioritize keystone species? One is that keystone species basically play a unique role that affects many other organisms. For example, wolves regulate deer populations, preventing like things like overgrazing and allowing vegetation to thrive. If wolves become endangered, you understand that the deer population is going to explode, which is going to lead to overbrowsing. What this is going to do is that you basically devastate plant communities and affect like numerous other species that rely on those plants for food and habitats. These are problems that you would face if you don't buy into our word. Then finally, you need to understand that keystone species basically shape their environments. For instance, beavers create wetlands by building dams, which provide habitats for countless other species. If beavers decline, these wetlands may dry up, which is going to result in habitat loss for many other organisms. Like these are the arms that would exist in the opposition world, which they do not feel to engage in today's debates. Then moving on, panel, we think that what is the impact of concentrating on keystone species, what harm, what utilities does it provide for this endangered species? There's another panel that keystone species that basically play a critical role in maintaining the balance of their ecosystem. By focusing on their conservation, the overall health of the ecosystem is going to preserve, which is going to support the survival of many other species, including the endangered ones that are in a position is trying to fight for. We think that our world basically co-ops all the benefits in the opposition base. But then also understand that conservation efforts for keystone species often involve protecting their habitats. This protection can even create a safe environment for other species, including endangered ones, and like the endangered species, which is going to allow them to thrive. But then lastly, you need to understand that healthy ecosystems that are maintained by keystone species can support a greater diversity of plants and animal life. What does this mean? By conserving these key players, the overall biodiversity of the ecosystem is going to be enhanced, which is going to benefit the endangered species through increased availability of resources and even reduce competition. We think that our world is more efficient when it comes to utilizing resources, but then also the burden on the opposition bench, basically is to prove how their world is more beneficial and is more less burdening to this environmental movement, which they fail to basically do in this debate. Our world wins on utilities, our world wins on why on prioritization, and our world wins on what is best for environmental movement. We are proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Let's welcome the member of opposition to start the case from the closing opposition side. Here.
Okay, check. My audio is my audio okay, stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was confirming audibility. Is my audio okay?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, then it's fine. I think you'll just give me a few seconds to set up my timer and like try to organize my notes and stuff. All right. I think just to not waste a lot of time, I'm probably going to begin in a few seconds. But for points of information, I think I would really love a long diagonal engagement. So I really encourage opening government to ask a point of information. I think for closing government, sorry, wait, wait. First, wait, guys, first, excuse me. Okay, guys, sorry about that. So I was saying I really love a long diagonal engagement. So I'll probably take OG in my member speech. And since I'm ironing, I'll probably gladly take the closing government in my whip speech. Yeah. So that said and done. Chair, you can start my time in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, environmental movements are basically moral actors. That means first, they're guided by principles of sustainability, but then secondly, the obligation to protect the ecosystem. The delta of this debate is then two. First, which model best guarantees comprehensive sustainability of the ecosystem? But then secondly, the question of whether this trade-off is justifiable as a matter of principle. From side closing opposition, if we prove to you one, that focusing on keystone animals harms the sustainability of the ecosystem as a whole, but then secondly, that the trade-off is unjustified, that means we win this debate of closing opposition. But a couple of engagement. First, we want to reject the premise panel that we are basically faced with some idea of scarcity of resources. If government team is supposed to prove this, then they need to tell us why the resources that exist in status quo is basically something that is not enough, right? Panel understand that climate action is the new hot cake in terms of social justice support. That is why we have climate change conventions happening every year, so that they fund, so that they channel support to the idea of protection of the environment and the ecosystem as a whole. That is why we have the Green Climate Fund being extended to third world countries, and that is why we have all these billions of dollars being channeled to climate change action at the end of the day. So first panel, we think we want to reject the premise that there's scarcity of resources. But then secondly, even if you buy the premise that there's basically scarcity of resources and that justifies the need for prioritization, we'll basically prove it from side closing opposition as to why then an holistic approach is one that needs to be prioritized instead of basically just engaging one. The most important material that comes from closing government, and I think we shall agree to closing government, that this debate starts in the closing half, is the material on the idea of the contribution of the unique species to the particular society. And I think my case basically directly engages that. What you get from side opening opposition is on the things of you get a lot of utility, you get the idea of cost effectiveness and resource optimization. And I think we should basically engage this in our speech at the end of the day. First extension then you'll get from side closing opposition is the fact that you see the first extension that you'll get from us is on the fact that concentration on keystone means that you harm the comprehensive sustainability of the ecosystem as a whole. But why is this extension the most debate-winning extension? First panel, understand that all houses in this debate agree that survival of the ecosystem is of the ultimate impact. But then secondly, understand panel that the ecosystem is grossly interdependent, right? That necessarily means even the keystone species depend on other species for survival. I don't understand that the Pacific salmons that CAP provides for you in InfoSlide depend on species like sardines and crabs for basically feeding and as their prey and stuff like that. But secondly, panel, notice that sardines and these crabs are also basically classified as endangered species. At the end of the day, I think that putting priority on keystone species means these things. First is that you relax the protection of other species at the end of the day, for example, sardines and crabs. But then secondly, it means you often have the possibility of shooting up the population of keystone relative to the population of their prey at the end of the day. The overall impact of this is that their prey then become more endangered than before. The impact of this particular argument is that the population of the prey necessarily fall. When the population of the prey of the species means you affect the natural and holistic development of the ecosystem as a whole. Worst case scenario, if the sardines and the herrings basically reduce in population, it necessarily means the Pacific salmons, which you define as keystone in this particular debate, basically have nothing to eat. At a point in time where you endanger the population of their prey, it necessarily means in the long run, endanger the sustainability of the keystone species itself. If you want to buy the premise that these keystone species are basically very important, then you need to concede that the population of their prey is actually also very important, because these are the things that these keystone basically depend on for their survival at the end of the day. At the point in time where you prioritize protection of the keystone species, it means you basically kill some sort of ecological imbalance, because you shall have more keystone species than their prey at the end of the day. It means in the long run, you affect the sustainability of these keystone species at the end of the day, but then from the bigger picture, it then affect the sustainability of the ecosystem as a whole. The comparative then on our side is to say that you actually try to achieve some sort of ecological balance, right? That means we have good population of Pacific salmons, but then also it means we also protect the sustainability of the sardines and the herrings. That necessarily means we actually preserve some sort of ecological balance. This is only an exclusive benefit that you get exclusively from CO, and that's why we win the debate. Opening opposition comes and tells you that you see these species are important, but we mechanize for you and we tell you about the nature of the interdependence of the system. And before I proceed, I'll take OG.
Yeah. Panel, since there is the concession in the upper page that this debate is more on the principles of utility and long-term sustainability, then we believe OG wins, as we've shown you how our award has more utility and long-term sustainability against the upward.
I have your point. Panel, we think the way in which you should gauge utility in this particular debate is where we get a maximization of an ecological balance, right? At a point in time where you get ecological balance from outside of the debate, then it means an holistic approach, just like opening opposition tells you, yields more utility than prioritization of one, which leads to a long-term harm of the other. The second extension you get from side closing opposition is then on the fact that the trade-off is not justified at the end of the day. But secondly, the reason why this is the most debate-winning material and why you should rank CO first, CG second, is on two things. One, understand that environmental movements are basically moral actors, right? That necessarily means they have taken the moral obligation to defend the environment, not only because of the utility that they yield, but secondly, because of the agency that these species have in and of itself. Why is this true? We think most environmental movements have often bought into the concept of animal rights. That necessarily means these animals basically have agency in and of itself, right? This necessarily means that all animals equally deserve protection. And why you should credit this to CO is because opening opposition simply tells you that you cannot choose, but they don't mechanize to you why these people cannot choose. Tell you that they're moral actors and all these endangered species have basically some sort of agency at the end of the day. But then why is this true? Three metrics. First, opening government will really frames to the idea that all these species are endangered and they're basically facing some sort of extinction. Second metric, all of them have the same rights, right? And because of the agency that is according to the animal rights movement. But the third mechanization here is to say that we contend from CO that they both have the same value to the ecosystem. Why is this true? And why this is then directly engages the unique contribution material that comes from closing government. Closing government tells you that they have unique contribution. We say that all of them have the same value. But then why is this true? One, we think that they're all extremely important for the survival of each other. In my last 50 seconds, I mechanized for my first extension that these animals depend on each other for survival. That necessarily means all of them are extremely important to each other. But then secondly, collectively, they all ensure the sustainability of the entire ecosystem. That is why, from a moral point of view, these people cannot choose who to protect us. Proud CEO.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Without wasting time, let's welcome the government whip to end the case from the government side. Here. Government whip.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. I'll take POIs in my 5th minute. Please don't badger until it's my 5th minute. Yeah. So then just give me a minute. Let me set my time. Okay. So I'll most likely prioritize POIs from the opening since we didn't have a direct engagement to them. But although if closing has a POI, I'll take it as well. So given that I'm audible and everyone's ready, I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, Mr. Speaker, do pay attention. There are 3 clashes in this debate. The first is on the principles of conservation. The second is on resource utilization. And the third is on the transcending effect of both worlds. Now, there's a consensus in this debate, right, in terms of limited resources. Who makes a holistic argument saying that we need to cater for the vast entirety of, the milieu in terms of animals and species that exist in our society. But then this is very problematic in and of itself, and I'll tell you why. Because CO makes it even worse. They try to avoid this concession, saying that resources are very much readily available. But that is very problematic from both benches, because the major incentive for site CG to even say that they want to prioritize keystone species is because of a lack of resources to go around to cater for each and every species. That is to say, when this lack of resources arises, which species do you prefer? Which species do you prioritize? Do you prioritize this keystone species, or do you want to cater for the vast majority of species, even endangered species, at the same level, even though it's going to come at the expense of one at the other? That is to say, what we are saying from side CG is that in any instance, whether resources are available or not, especially when they are not available, we want to prioritize these keystone species because of the transcending effect they have on endangered species, right? This was one clash that was not engaged from side opposition, because side governments, we have shown time again that there's a transcending effect that comes with the protection of these keystone species, and then opposition, they can't prove otherwise. They can't even debunk this. They come forward and come and rule this whole egalitarianism. But egalitarianism is very flawed in this debate. It cannot run in this debate, because you need to consider what is important. It is not the principle that should run in this debate. As my partner already told you, that the principle of conservation in this debate exists upon the premise of the value species. That is to say, which species provide more importance to the environment, even if it comes at the expense of another species in terms of prioritization. That is the principle that should have been engaged on in this debate, and we lastly start from side opposition. I will do more on that in my speech. Now, do notice that my partner has already given better characterization and impact, which was largely missing from our opening. I'll do more analysis on that. But before that, rebuttals. What do we get from side OO? As I have said before, and I'll reiterate, they try to bring the idea of a holistic approach, several principles of egalitarianism, but that is not a principle that you should use in this debate, because in instances where you need to shift these resources, where it's much more beneficial, where it will provide more utility to the environment, these principles cannot run. It should be based on the principle of the value of the individualistic importance of this species. And we believe that these keystone species are very important to the environment. I'll show you more analysis on why they are more important. The second thing we get from side OO is that, okay, it goes against the principle of prioritizing one over the other. But then the principle which we from side CG run in this debate, that is the principle of value of an individual species, is something that takes away that argument. My partner already tells you better about that principle. The third thing we get from them is that, okay, they want to focus on even saving endangered species in the instances where resources are scarce. They do not even tell us why or how that helps the environment. They just tell us, oh, it's better, it provides more utility. We needed more analysis from side opposition, which was very lacking. He fell out of the premise of this debate. Now, the fourth thing we get from side opening opposition is, this is very important, please pay attention, is on recreation and tourism. That the loss of these endangered species, because you want to prioritize keystone species, will lead to loss of recreation and tourism. But this is very problematic. Why? Because the loss of keystone species can have broad implications for human communities that rely on healthy ecosystems and for tourism and recreation. For example, if we take into consideration the decline of a keystone fish species, it can be local fishes that are used by local communities and that are also being used by these fishery museums to display them, or these fishery, conservative centers to show them as a source of tourism. That is to say, these keystone species also serve as a source of tourism and recreation. That cannot go credited to their bench. This engages the clash of economic benefits. As I said, it's also important for those communities that largely rely on this keystone fish species, and that is on the economic class that exists in this debate. Now, what we get from side CO? Side CO came and did try to give more analysis on that, but we believe that our principle and our characterization already takes away, the whole idea of the principle of egalitarianism that they also try to run in this debate, coupled with the fact that they didn't want to make a concession that, resources can be scarce. They said that resources will be evenly distributed and it's readily available. But then if resources is readily available to every species available, then why did we even have this debate in the first place? That's very problematic in and of itself. But then we still get one piece of extension from them. They talk about the benefits of a holistic approach and the endangered prioritization. But then we already cater for that in an argument provided by my partner, that is on the long-term ecosystem health. Notice the long-term ecosystem health. Why is this true? This is true because of 4 reasons. One, we solve the issue of environmental endangerment. That is to say, the issues that lead to environmental endangerment of this species in the first place. Okay, I'll take you. What do you have?
So
Quickly.
your argument on transcendency cannot fly, because when these endangered species are no more, they can't be replaced. But then the comparative is that for the keystone species, some other bodies can help out. Why should you then prioritize doing what you can have other persons do when you can focus on your own mandate as a body in itself?
Okay, the first thing to say is that it's not in every instance that what this keystone species carry out another species can do. In terms of pollination, these are the most effective insects in terms of pollination, and if they are taken out of the system of existence, it is going to be very problematic, because we need these trees apart from pollination, the growth and the effects that trees have on the environment. So you cannot just come and say, they can be easily replaced. They cannot be easily replaced. And secondly, you need to even show, it was a burden on you to show how these endangered species are so very important to the environment, because if you want predators, there are a vast majority of predators that can replace them. Anything, it's the endangered species that can easily be replaced in our environment, because we've seen a lot of endangered species come and go, and they've gotten replaced, and it has not really have any effect on our environment. So that was a very counterfactual argument. Now, what I was saying on long-term ecosystem health, it is true because of 4 reasons. One, we solve the issue that leads to this endangerment. That is to say, when we cater for the issue of disproportionality which exists, is given in the input slide, this disproportionality, that is to say, when you prioritize these keystone species, they get more evenly distributed, more proportionate in the environment, and hence they multiply in number and can cater for the environment. Hence, they provide long-term ecosystem health and take away the issues that cause the endangerment. The second thing is to say they promote the resilience of the ecosystem. That is to say, these individuals, this species, continue to protect this environment. Why do we win from side CG? We win because we show better characterization and impact of priority involved in this debate. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Without wasting time, let's welcome the opposition whip to end the case from the opposition side. Here.
Am I still audible and clear, most importantly?
Yes, you are.
Cool. CG, yeah, here's your time to ask points of information. I'll just keep quiet in my 4th minute and then I allow you guys to ask a point of information. Cool. Right. Just a few seconds. Again, sorry. Okay. I think I'll start my speech in. Is someone unmuted? All right. All right. So I think I'll start my speech in about. Okay, I think I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. A few things, Chair. We don't think the availability of resources can be one contingent metric of when who wins or loses this debate, right? Simply because on the first premise, I say to you from my member speech that resources are readily available, right? That means probably resources can cater for both holistic approach. But then secondly, we tell you that even if the argument is on utility, right, we are happy and willing to defend that because we come and tell you that the best utility is in terms of maintaining ecological balance. And that's where a holistic approach becomes the best utility that you can get from this particular debate. That necessarily means that one, from side CO, we concede that the premise or the metric of utility of this particular model is one that is actually paramount, right? But then secondly, we tell you that the best way you can actually judge this debate, Chair, is by considering one, where we get a long-term sustainability of the ecosystem as a whole, but then secondly, whether the trade-off is actually justifiable. And that is what should judge this debate, Chair. But first, if you think that closing government is winning today's debate, notice that their argument basically hinges on two things, right? That is the first idea that these keystone species basically have some sort of unique contribution to society. Secondly, they tell you that protecting them transcends protection to the other people. All of their arguments of multiplying the number, promoting resilience, all contingent on the fact that their protection actually transcends to the protection of the other people. From side CO, just like in my member speech, we are willing to concede, right, that these people have some sort of unique contribution to society. But what happens in this case is that the existence of the keystone species in and of itself is contingent on the existence of the entire ecological system as a whole. Why is this true? We tell you that these Pacific salmons that actually happen to be classified as the keystone species basically feed on other fish, for example, sardines, crabs, and herrings, which also happen to be classified as endangered species at the end of the day. The characterization that no side from government contends with in tonight's debate is what we tell you from closing opposition, that the ecosystem is basically one that is interdependent, right? And that necessarily means if you upset the ecological balance, it means in the long run, you end up affecting even the primary species you want to protect in and of itself, right? That necessarily means if you want to buy the case of closing government, then you have to consider the fact that our argument runs logically prior. Because if these keystone species are prioritized, and these other endangered species are not prioritized, it necessarily means you upset the ecological balance. In the long run, you actually end up affecting this kind of species. The reason why I started with that clash is because closing government happens to be the most relevant government bench in tonight's debate. But that's why we tell you that from our case, it's actually one that runs logically prior. The arguments that you get from opening opposition, opening government, are basically this: that one, you get some sort of utility. And from that aspect, we really contend and we say, yes, they probably give some sort of unique contribution to society. But the fact that species depend on the protection of the endangered species as a whole because of the idea of the ecological balance necessarily means that the best utility that you can actually derive in tonight's debate is the utility that one is going to sustain even the keystone species in the long run, but then secondly, sustain the ecological balance. Tell you that you only achieve some sort of holistic approach, and that is the best utility you can get. It's not yet my 4th minute, so I'll probably not engage you. But why is our material then the most debate-winning material? Opening opposition comes and tells you that, you see, these people can basically not choose because they're moral actors and stuff like that. What they don't tell you is that is the reason why then these people cannot choose. From side closing opposition, we say that one, think these people because they're moral actors, right? That means they've taken the moral obligation to defend the natural environment, right? Not only because of the utility, but because of the agency that is derived in and of itself. But that necessarily means if you actually buy into the concept of animal rights and the fact that all these animals and species actually need some sort of protection, then it becomes hypocritical to say that one deserves protection more than the other. But even in their best case scenario, when you say that because of their value, we tell you that their value is similar. If the keystone species have some sort of unique contribution in society, then this contribution is only sustained by the existence and by the sustainability of the population of these other endangered species at the end of the day. At a point in time where you actually upset this ecological balance, you even cease to actually derive the unique benefits that you want to argue for from side government in a nice way. That necessarily means on the value, all of them have value and they deserve equal protection. Closing.
So from opening government, the delta within this debate is in what world does environmental movement, whether they are moral actors or not, what world do they get traction? Our world gives them that traction because they prioritize a species that provides more utility to the society. You say they're a moral actor, our world makes them to be like more utilitarian to the society.
Closing, do you have a point of information? Okay, I don't think I don't think closing has a point of information. Panel, I think you should not buy the argument that this debate is all about traction or stuff like that. We think the principle that we ran to you on the idea of all these species deserving protection is actually one that outweighs the idea of traction and stuff like that. Simply because these environmental movements look at the bigger picture that's protecting the environment rather than just looking at the optics and how people necessarily look at them. But even if you want to buy opening government's case and talk about utility, we tell you why the best form of utility is actually maintaining some sort of ecological balance at the end of the day. And that is why the case of closing opposition still ranks better than the case of opening opposition in tonight's debate. But the other reason why we win tonight's debate, and this is on a whole at the end of the day, is because even if you're to concede the idea that this debate is all about utility, still to tell you from side closing opposition that you see there's some sort of interdependence and the idea that ecological balance needs to be maintained, right? That necessarily means you don't want to disproportionately protect the keystones, and that necessarily means shooting up their population. It necessarily means endangering the population of their prey at the end of the day. At a point in time where you shrink the population of their prey, it means in the long run, this keystone species have nothing to feed on. That necessarily means the ecological system basically collapses at the end of the day. And I think this is actually something that is very bad. If you go into deliberation, ask yourself this question: from which side of the debate do you maintain ecological balance? We tell you that you best achieve this through an holistic approach. If you go into the debate asking yourself the question of whether these keystone species are basically very important, then remember this: they basically need the other endangered species to be able to survive at the end of the day. At a point in time where you actually upset this ecological balance, you have some long-term disaster that is coming. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Let me remember. The motion we just debated is this House believes that environmental movement should concentrate their conservation efforts on protecting keystone animals, even at the expense of other endangered species. So this is basically a silent round. There is no OA. And once again, my name is Samson Kokouvi SHITOR, and thank you very much for having me as your chair. See you and good luck in the subsequent rounds.
Sorry, Chair. What was it you said? I think the chair has left. I didn't get you clearly.
I'm just wishing you good luck in the subsequent rounds. This is a silent round, so there is no
Alright,
OA.
thank you so much for judging.
Okay, thank you.